Okay, Teacher Think here, and today I'd like to talk about reading and give you some food for thought on ways you can get a reluctant reader to read. And what I mean is not teaching a kid to read. This is not for first and second graders, kindergarten, where you're learning phonics and everything. This is for advice on kids who know how to read and just don't really enjoy it and don't really do it and don't like it and don't want to. How can you get them to do it? And I think we all know that reading is important, but it's starting to get a little shocking out there about how little kids actually do read and how much damage it's doing to them. It is the best thing you can do for your education is to read. If there were just one subject, I would make it reading, because if you're a good reader, you can learn about absolutely anything. Uh, so I've got a few things to look at here just to get started, which are, this is the Guardian. Children are reading less than ever before, and it's true. They give a lot of statistics, but it's just going down and down. The number of kids who read on a daily basis, which is really important, and the ones who read for pleasure, as in not a book that's required for school, but just something that they want to read. This is another one that's, uh, along the same vein. Children's reading shrinking due to apps, games, and YouTube. It's going down. Uh, and it's really kind of heartbreaking because I will ask kids, what are you reading? And more during my teaching career, I would hear them say, I'm not reading a book. And I'd say, well, are you planning on reading a book? And no, not until the teacher requires it. And it's just really too bad because they're missing out on a big part of life and they don't even know it really. Now, if they're not good at it, then it's one of those things. It turns into a downward spiral. I don't have an article on this here, but uh, if a child is not reading very much in fourth grade, he's that much farther behind in fifth grade, and it's that much harder to keep up, and it's that much less pleasurable. Sixth grade, where you might start getting some tougher books, you might get into Shakespeare and stuff in the sixth grade. You're going to start getting really lost, and seventh and eighth grade, you're going to be kind of giving up. And I know I have known personally in my own life students who, people my own age and everything who have never read a book, not in high school or really ever. And today they can always just look up Schmoop and get a list of the main characters and summaries and talk to some other people about a book and just kind of get along. And it's really too bad because they're missing a lot, and it snowballs. It gets harder and harder to recover from that. So it's definitely something to be on top of early. So I've got a few things to talk about to get kids to read, and I'm going to save my best advice for last. Okay, you might roll your eyes about it, but it's my best advice. And if you just checked ahead and you came back, then good for you. For you're still listening. Uh, First of all, the best thing you can do is set the right example. If you read, then your children will read. However, I know that a lot of people don't read. I know many adults who do not read. And if you're one of them, I'm not saying you're a bad person. But do something about it. And I can suggest this. If you start reading every night and you really just don't do that, it's probably one of those habits that will disappear after 2 or 3 weeks anyway. But what you can do is at least just have a book that you are intending to read, or at least ostensibly reading, something that you put on the bedside table. So your child sees that you at least have a book going. And the child should always have a book going. Even if it's not possible to read on a certain day, there should be a book where if they get that question, what are you reading right now, they've got an answer for it. So how to get them reading every day? Well, this can get a little more time intensive, but you may want to be reading with your child in a variety of ways. One thing you can do is have the child read to you. This is the easiest one, and they read aloud, and it keeps them on pace. It just keeps them doing it. You can monitor that they actually did it. And it's a good idea not to correct them very much as they read aloud. If you're reading along with them, don't stop them on a pronunciation. Don't even really tell them if they skip a line. I mean, depending on the level of the reader, if he skips a line or something, just don't even mention it. He'll probably figure it out. But one thing you can do is say when there's an unfamiliar word, you can ask him about that, say at the end of a paragraph or at some point where it's logical to stop for a minute, just not right in the middle, and explain the word. Children learn words mostly through context and usually from their parents and from their teachers when they're talking and using the words. So they learn a lot during dinner time, for example. If words are used, they'll learn the words. So it's a good idea to talk about them. You don't have to keep a list or anything, but as long as you talk about them, So you go to school, you have a vocabulary book, you study the vocab words. That's a little bit of a last resort because it'll help children with recognizing words that they don't know, and they'll know what it means when they come across it, but they're less apt to actually use the words later on. And sometimes they do just get into a routine of studying those words for that test, and then they just completely forget about them. Interesting thing about teaching a kid a word is that, especially if it's in context and it really means something, he or she will come back saying, I've heard that word a number of times over the last couple of weeks. That was so weird. Like I just saw it here and I heard it there, and it's like, well, the word's always been there. It's just you were reading right over it. So I think like all of us, if you come across an unfamiliar word, there's a tendency to just kind of skip it. You don't have to do that for every word. It should never get tedious like that. The other thing you can do is switch off reading. I wouldn't make that strict, like you read a page, I read a page, you read a page, I read a page, or paragraph, or whatever. Just come to logical conclusions. It shouldn't be so strict. You might do the vast majority of the reading, and the child will do a little bit of the reading. But hopefully, as long as he's following along, that'll work. They have a tendency to stop reading along with you, as I'm sure you know. You just have to worry about that as much as you want to worry about it. And the last thing you can do is really just do all the reading for the child, and that's fine too. I think they learn a great deal about reading from an adult reading a book to them, because what you do is you don't just read the book in kind of a monotone voice and just get to the end of the chapter and say, we read that chapter. That's basically a fourth grader's approach to reading a book. Anytime there's something to discuss, you just go off on that topic and just say, remember that was like Uncle Joe's last summer, and you have a discussion about that. I mean, this is what reading is supposed to be. It sparks your imagination. It has you put in some of yourself to the book. It's an interactive process. It's very interactive with a book. And that's exactly what they should be learning. And you can model that by just very casually just having fun with the book. You can ask questions of the student as you read, and I think that's a good idea. Just don't expect the right answers, and don't worry if they're the wrong answers. Sometimes ask questions where you can't really verify it. A great question is so that they're not always thinking, well, is this right or wrong? And then I'll be told. Just say, what do you think about this? What's your opinion of this character? That kind of thing. They might start with good or nice, whatever, and then hopefully you can build that up over time. But a great question to ask is at the end of a chapter or at some logical point, what do you think is going to happen next? And they probably won't guess right, but that doesn't matter. It's the beginnings of drawing inferences from the book. What do you think is going to happen next? Now, what do you do about getting them to read on their own? I think a consistent time is the best thing for that. So and I think bedtime is the best time for it. So if they're going to bed with a book and they read then, perfect. Gets them relaxed. They'll probably fall asleep with a book, maybe. It's a good thing to have that after all your other work has been done, so you don't feel like you have anything hanging over your head. And you can dream about the book. What about rewards? I think rewards are a little bit of a last resort. The reward ought to be the book itself. The reward ought to be the knowledge that they're making progress towards making themselves a better mind and a better person, really. That's a little bit of a stretch for some people. Next level down is really that they should just want to get your approval. Good job. That should be enough. If that's not working, and you can combine this, I think keeping track of how much they read makes a difference. And I would suggest that you not keep track of how many books they read, because short books are not the same as long books, or how much time they read, because that really doesn't say all that much. But I would just suggest keeping track of how many words they read. And it's not as hard as you think. And kids actually kind of get into it. If you just have them count up the number of words on one page like this, just count up all the words. I've tried it a bunch of different ways, like count a few lines and estimate and get an average. And if they just count all the words on one page, then they can figure out how many words they've read in a sitting or in a day. And I think for, it depends completely on the child, but in general, I mostly taught fifth grade. You'll see me leaning towards that a little bit in these things. But if a child's reading 10,000 words a night in a free reading book consistently, that is stellar. That is really, really top-notch reading as far as a habit. But even if it's something, even if they only have time for 500 or 1,000 or just a page worth, then fine, that's good. Or just set the bar a little lower for someone in the third grade or fourth grade or wherever the child is. They kind of like to see that number go up, and it's more measurable. It's more reliable to have a word count and not a page count or a book count, because those they don't give you the same measure. Should you pay a child? Well, let's see. No. But if you have to, do it. I've had certain parents come to me and say, we've tried everything, and we finally just did resort to saying we'll pay you $5 every time you read a book or something. And at least it got them started. And at least it did something. Because sometimes, there may be a developmental issue where you just need a little time to get past something. And maybe you just need that just to muscle through that and then see where you are on the other end. So I'm not going to completely rule it out, nor will I tell anybody they're being a bad person for doing it. But it shouldn't be the first thing you want to do. And you want to sort of shuffle it away as soon as you can, because if it's just really for a reward like that, it's not good. I would definitely not reward reading with TV or video games. There's no competition. It is not going to match up. It's not going to make sense for the kid. It is just not a good plan. And even just on the idea of I've heard people say, have them read 15 minutes and then watch TV for 15 minutes. So I don't know how you watch TV for 15 minutes. It's got to be like half an hour, right? Well, what if it's an hour show? You start getting into a negotiation on that. And then, you're going to read for an hour. Some kids are just not really capable of reading for an hour at that stage. Anyway, there's just no comparison. A half hour reading a book is going to feel like 3 hours, and a half hour watching a TV show is going to feel like 5 minutes. So just don't even bring in the comparison. It's not going to work very well. Try to buy them books as much as you can. And by buy them books, I mean also go to the library. I should include that, because not everybody has tons of money to throw around on books, especially when the kids aren't reading them all. But as much as possible, buy that extra book, even if they never get to it. I'd say my reading ratio is probably to buy 4 books, actually read one of them. It's been driving me crazy for years, and I'll put a moratorium on it and say, I'm not reading any more. I'm not buying any more books until I read the ones that I have. And you can make a little bit of progress with that. But there are going to be books that you're excited about that you never get to, and don't worry about it. They may well get to it, and they shouldn't feel like they're bound to a certain book forever until they finish it, it'll make it too hard to choose a book at the library or at the bookstore if it's going to be a death sentence. So as much as possible do that. But libraries are great. I mean, bookstores are great because the kid gets to keep the book and they see them building up on the shelf and stuff. But I'm also drawing a distinction between that and Kindles and e-readers. Kids generally like to read the book. I love the Kindle and e-reader part because they can look words up just by touching them. They can keep a list of words that they're doing. That's a great thing. But kids actually like the book. And a huge part of that is really just that as you read, you can see how much you read. It's easier to flip through and see how long this next chapter is going to be. Kids like to do that. They like to know what they're getting into, and it's easier than doing that with an ebook. You get more of a sense of satisfaction out of having that book that you put on your shelf than you do with something that finally gets up to 100%. As a matter of fact, I found an article on that. Why do kids prefer read, print, and not ebooks? And it's basically for the reasons I just gave you. But you can see that for the most part, that's what they like. They'd really just rather read that type of a book. Books on tape. Should you be letting them read books on tape? I would say yes, within certain limits. There's an old saying. You'll remember 10% of what you listen to, 40% of what you read, and 70% of what you write. So whether that's a real statistic or not, who knows? But I think we all know it's basically true. So you do miss more when you're listening to a book. But I think for someone who's maybe got a little dyslexia or has trouble reading or just doesn't want to do it, I mean, it's definitely more effort. There's no question. Then it's okay to do an e-reader, and as long as they're actually paying attention, then they will at least develop that focus for a longer period that they can then transfer to reading the actual book. And there are some things where you can get Learning Allies is a good one. I'm going to put that on the screen right now. Learning Ally is you have to pay for it, but they've got a lot of books, especially ones like you read in school. And they have good readers for it. And you also have, Kindle does this too, but you also have a little highlighter go across the page. If you buy the Kindle and the audiobook, this does the same thing. It highlights the words as you read. So it keeps their eyes on that page, and then that gets them in the habit. And I think they're in general surprised at how much they've actually read after a while. Because when you're sort of pushing your own eyes across the page, it feels like longer than if you're reading. You realize, wow, you're really just kind of going at a slower than talking pace, and yet you still read 20 or 30 pages, and they're following along. So I think it's a pretty good experience, and it's something that can be good for going to bed with too. They'll miss parts of it, but you can always rewind. Now, my best advice, get rid of the computers, get rid of the cell phones. Now you're going to roll your eyes because obviously you really can't get rid of the computer. A lot of schools, more and more and more, are putting everything on the computer, and you can't just turn off the Wi-Fi and get rid of the computer. It's not possible. And that opens up the gates for chatting and texting and everything. Going to other websites, getting distracted, etc. And that's just something you have to solve on an individual basis. That's a really tough one. However, the cell phone, there's no reason whatsoever that they should have the cell phone at home. I mean, why? To text? I mean, I don't see a good reason for it. Anyway, it's a fairly easy one to do because they don't really need it to do their work. And there's nothing wrong with saying, we don't use the cell phone in the house. Maybe I do because I'm the parent and I may need a certain call from a certain person at a certain time, and that's important. You don't. Plug it in and leave it on this shelf, and it stays there overnight. It's taking a tremendous amount away from kids to have too many of these other distractions, and that comes back to this one. The reading's shrinking due to apps, games, and YouTube. That is definitely taking up most of their time. And it's literally just crushing reading completely. Like, kids know that reading's good and everything, but they're much rather going to want to watch YouTube, and they think they can do both. But you really can't. And by both I mean this: you can't read and listen at the same time. A lot of people think they can, and you definitely can't. If you're sort of doing something that requires interpreting something on the page or reading it and you're listening, you're going to do one or the other, and it's going to slow one of them down, and you're going to miss certain things. You just can't get around that. There's no such thing as multitasking. There's really only monotasking. Multitasking is doing parts of a lot of tasks at around the same time, all of them slower. So, I mean, task shifting maybe works, but multitasking as in doing things at the same time, no, not unless it's walking and chewing gum and talking. You can do those three things at the same time, but that other stuff is not going to work. They think it works. Sometimes, there'll be a kid I'm talking to or whatever. This can happen in tutoring, where you see the eyes going down to the lower right part of the page, and they're listening and they're saying, uh-huh. But what's really happening is that there are text messages coming in from friends, and that's where their attention really is. And then they'll come back and they'll be like, wait a minute, what was that? And you kind of have to repeat it, and it definitely doesn't work. The other thing is that by dividing your attention, it doesn't work. When I first heard this, I didn't believe it, but they say it takes 15 minutes to go from watching something online to being really interrupted to being back in your workflow. And I think that's definitely true. Now, I've just tried to watch myself and just watch how that works. If you're watching a screen with a lot of lights and a lot of changing dynamic things going on, and you go straight to reading, it feels like you've just come off the highway and now you're just walking. I mean, it's almost a torture for kids especially. I think they need more time than that. And so they can't just watch YouTube and then do some homework and then go back to YouTube. That means they'll have light, sort of superficial attention the whole way through. They'll be able to complete the task, but nowhere near as well as they could have, I think. So, that's a conundrum. That's tough, but something's got to be done about it, and that's my best advice. So I hope that was helpful to you, and we will see you next time.